It began on a night when sound itself seemed to hold secrets too ancient for human ears to comprehend. A night when Marcus Webb, a mechanic in the quiet town of Redemption Falls, Wyoming, captured something on his audio recording equipment that would force him to question every truth he'd ever been taught about angels, aliens, and the thin veil between heaven and deception. Marcus was 49 years old, with hands permanently stained with motor oil, and a mind that found peace in the logic of engines and electrical systems. A divorced father of 2 grown children who rarely called, a man who'd spent the last decade sleeping in the apartment above his garage, listening to police scanners and shortwave radio to fill the silence that had become his only companion after his wife left and his mother passed, and the small-town life he'd chosen felt less like choice and more like sentence he was serving for crimes he couldn't name. He'd always been drawn to sound, to frequencies and waveforms, to the invisible vibrations that carried information through air and wire, and he'd built a small studio in the corner of his garage where he recorded everything from engine diagnostics to ambient noise, analyzing spectrograms and frequency patterns with an obsession that his ex-wife had called unhealthy, but that Marcus knew was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality when grief threatened to pull him under completely. On this particular November evening, Marcus was working late on a transmission rebuild when he heard it, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, a frequency that made his tools vibrate on their pegboard mounts, that made the fluorescent lights flicker and dim, that made his chest cavity resonate like he'd become a tuning fork for something cosmic and terrible and beautiful beyond human categories. He stopped working immediately, grabbed his field recorder, and began capturing the sound, watching the input levels spike and waver in patterns that suggested intelligence, that looked almost like language if language could exist without words, that made his engineering mind insist this was manufactured rather than natural, was signal rather than noise, was communication rather than random atmospheric phenomenon. The sound lasted for nearly 7 minutes, during which Marcus stood motionless with his recorder extended, like an offering, like a prayer, like a question asked of universe that had never answered him before, but that seemed suddenly and terrifyingly present, seemed to be speaking directly to him through frequencies his ears could barely process, but that his equipment captured perfectly, that his technology could translate into visual form, even if his consciousness struggled to comprehend the meaning. When the sound stopped, Marcus stood in silence so complete it felt oppressive, felt like the world had been holding its breath and hadn't yet decided whether to exhale or suffocate. And he looked at his recorder and saw that he'd captured clean audio, saw that the levels were good, saw that whatever this was, it hadn't been hallucination or equipment malfunction, but had been real, had been present, had been something that existed in physical reality enough to create pressure waves that moved through air and struck his microphone diaphragm and created electrical signals that his device had converted to digital information. Marcus transferred the audio file to his computer with hands that trembled slightly, loaded it into his spectral analysis software, and watched as the waveform rendered, watched as the frequency distribution appeared on his screen. And what he saw made his breath catch in his throat, made his rational mind rebel against what his eyes insisted was present, made him understand that he'd captured something that should not exist according to every framework he'd been taught, about what was possible and what was real, and what belonged to the realm of science versus the realm of superstition and paranoid fantasy. The spectrogram showed structure, showed patterns that were too perfect to be natural, showed what looked almost like a face emerging from the frequencies the way images emerge from static noise, and the face was beautiful, was serene, was luminous with qualities that reminded Marcus of medieval paintings he'd seen in art history class decades ago, paintings of angels and saints and beings that radiated divine light. And this face in the spectrogram had those same qualities, had Nordic features, and what appeared to be long hair and eyes, that even in visual representation of audio data seemed to convey intelligence and compassion, and something that felt like love, or at least what humans imagined love might look like if it came from beings that existed beyond human limitation and human corruption and human capacity for self-deception. Marcus stared at this image for long minutes, trying to convince himself he was seeing patterns where none existed, trying to dismiss it as pareidolia or confirmation bias or the tendency of human brains to find faces in random data. But the more he looked, the more detailed the image became. The more obviously intentional it appeared, the more clearly it seemed to be not accident, but design, not coincidence, but communication, not random arrangement of frequencies, but carefully constructed message encoded in sound that required specific technology and specific awareness to decode and perceive. But then Marcus noticed something else, something that made his wonder curdle into unease, made his excitement transform into dread, made him understand that what he'd captured was far more complex and disturbing than simple message from benevolent cosmic intelligence. When he isolated specific frequency bands, when he filtered out the mid and high ranges and focused only on the lower frequencies, when he enhanced the contrast and adjusted the display parameters, he saw another image underlying the first, hidden beneath the beautiful Nordic face like a mask concealing true features. And this hidden image was reptilian, was predatory, was something with vertical pupils and scaled texture and angles that suggested intelligence, that was ancient and cold and utterly alien to mammalian consciousness, to human emotion, to everything that made Marcus feel safe in his assumption that the universe operated according to principles that included mercy and meaning, and some kind of benevolent order, rather than blind indifference or active predation. He felt his worldview cracking, felt the comfortable certainties he'd been taught dissolving like sugar in water, felt terror rising from depths of his psyche that had always suspected reality was darker and stranger than official narratives admitted, but that had never wanted to confront direct evidence that the suspicion was justified, that the conspiracy theorists he'd always dismissed might have been seeing something real, even if they lacked frameworks to explain it accurately or sanely. Marcus spent the rest of the night obsessively analyzing the recording, running it through every filter and processing algorithm he possessed, trying to convince himself the reptilian image was artifact of the analysis software, was distortion introduced by his processing rather than information actually present in the original audio. But every test confirmed the same result. There were two distinct layers in the recording, two separate faces encoded at different frequency ranges, the Nordic appearing in bands that human ears could process most easily, and the reptilian appearing in frequencies that existed below normal human hearing, that were felt as much as heard, that affected body and nervous system directly without requiring conscious perception. And Marcus began to understand that he'd captured evidence of deception, of beings that could project one appearance while hiding another beneath it, of intelligence that understood human psychology well enough to know that beautiful Nordic faces would bypass human defenses while reptilian faces would trigger fear and rejection, and that therefore these beings wore masks, used frequency manipulation to present themselves in forms that humans would accept and trust, and possibly worship, without questioning what existed beneath the illusion. What was actually communicating? What was truly present behind the projection, designed to make contact possible, without revealing truth that would shatter human sanity or trigger resistance that would interfere with whatever agenda these beings were pursuing? He thought about all the accounts he'd read online, the contactee testimonies and abduction reports and channeled messages, the descriptions of Nordic aliens who appeared in people's bedrooms and dreams and meditative states, who radiated love and wisdom and offered spiritual guidance about humanity's evolution and coming transformation. And he wondered how many of those encounters had been with beings wearing similar masks, with reptilian intelligence hiding beneath beautiful appearances, with predatory consciousness using humanity's desire for cosmic parents and benevolent guides against them, manipulating them through their own longing for meaning and connection and validation from the stars. Marcus had always been skeptical of such accounts, had dismissed them as wishful thinking or psychological projection, or the product of minds that couldn't handle the existential terror of living in a universe where humans were alone and insignificant and subject to forces that didn't care whether they lived or died. But now he had evidence, had captured proof that beings could indeed present multiple faces simultaneously. That deception was possible at levels he'd never imagined, that the line between angel and demon might be far blurrier than any religious tradition had taught him to believe. He tried to sleep, couldn't, spent the hours before dawn researching everything he could find about audio frequency manipulation and subliminal messaging and the ways that sound could be used to affect human consciousness and perception. And he discovered that intelligence agencies and military researchers had been studying these techniques for decades, had developed technologies that could influence mood and cognition through precisely calibrated frequencies, had experimented with using sound as weapon and as tool of control and as method of communication that bypassed conscious awareness and spoke directly to deeper levels of human psychology. Marcus began to wonder if the beings whose transmission he'd captured were using similar methods, were broadcasting messages that affected humans without their knowledge, were manipulating collective consciousness through frequencies that existed below the threshold of awareness, but that shaped behavior and belief nonetheless, were orchestrating human evolution according to their own agenda. While humans believed they were experiencing spontaneous spiritual awakening or personal growth, or the natural unfolding of cosmic plan that had humanity's best interests at heart. The implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes falling, like walls crumbling, like the entire structure of meaning he'd built his life upon, revealing itself to be facade, concealing something far more complex and far less comforting than the simple story of good versus evil, light versus dark. Angels versus demons that his childhood church had taught him to accept without question or doubt, or the kind of critical thinking that would reveal how many contradictions and impossibilities those stories contained. Marcus went to his garage the next morning exhausted and disoriented, functioning on coffee and adrenaline, and the desperate need to do something with the information he'd stumbled into, to share it or investigate it further, or at least confirm that he wasn't losing his mind, that the recording and the spectrograms were real and verifiable, rather than elaborate hallucination his grief-damaged psyche had constructed to give his life drama and importance it otherwise lacked. He uploaded the files to secure cloud storage, made multiple backups, sent encrypted copies to email accounts he created specifically for this purpose, understanding that if these beings could manipulate frequency and appearance, then they might also be monitoring digital communications, might be aware that he'd captured their transmission, might be taking steps to suppress or eliminate evidence that threatened whatever they were trying to accomplish through their interactions with humanity. He felt paranoid thinking these thoughts, felt like conspiracy theorist he'd always mocked, but he also remembered the research he'd done overnight, the documented cases of witnesses and whistleblowers who died under suspicious circumstances, the pattern of evidence disappearing and people being discredited, and he understood that if what he'd captured was real, then paranoia was appropriate response, was survival instinct rather than mental illness, was recognition that powerful forces had interest in maintaining secrecy and would use whatever methods necessary to protect that secrecy from exposure that could undermine their agenda or awaken humans to the reality of their situation. The being appeared to Marcus 3 nights after the initial recording, manifested in his garage workshop as he was closing up for the evening, and Marcus felt his heart nearly stop as he watched the air shimmer and distort and then coalesce into humanoid form that was tall and luminous and beautiful, in ways that made his chest ache with something like longing or recognition or grief for beauty that human existence rarely contained. The being looked exactly like the Nordic face he'd seen in the spectrogram, was the image made flesh, was confirmation that his analysis had been accurate, that the recording had captured visual signature of actual entity rather than random noise his imagination had organized into meaningful pattern. Marcus stood frozen, unable to move or speak, his mind racing through options that ranged from running to attacking to simply accepting whatever was about to happen, because he understood instinctively that he had no power here, that this being operated according to rules and capabilities that made human agency largely irrelevant, that whether he lived or died or was transformed or destroyed depended entirely on the being's intentions and his response to whatever communication was about to occur. The being didn't speak with vocal cords, but Marcus heard its voice clearly, felt it resonating in his mind and body simultaneously, felt it bypassing language to transmit meaning directly into his consciousness in ways that made words seem clumsy and inadequate by comparison. The being acknowledged that Marcus had captured its transmission, praised him for his technical skill and observational acuity, explained that very few humans possessed the combination of equipment and awareness necessary to detect the hidden frequencies, to see through the projected appearance to the underlying structure that most contactees never perceived consciously, even when their deeper awareness registered something wrong, something off, something that triggered unease they couldn't explain or articulate. The being communicated that Marcus's discovery was no accident, that he'd been led to this moment, that his interest in sound and frequency had been cultivated specifically to prepare him for this encounter, that the transmission he'd recorded had been intended for him specifically, even though thousands of other humans had been exposed to similar frequencies without possessing means to capture or analyze them, without having consciousness awake enough to recognize they were receiving communication that existed below threshold of normal human perception. Marcus found his voice, demanded to know what the being was, why it wore mask, why it hid reptilian features beneath Nordic appearance, whether it was predator or friend or something else, entirely beyond human categories of good and evil. The being's response came as both words and images, as explanation layered with demonstration, as teaching that engaged multiple levels of Marcus's consciousness simultaneously. It explained that it existed across multiple dimensions, that what Marcus perceived as single entity was actually composite of several aspects operating in different frequency ranges, that the Nordic appearance was the aspect most compatible with human psychology and perception, was the face that humans could relate to without triggering primal fear responses that would make communication impossible, while the reptilian aspect was different dimensional expression of the same consciousness, was layer that existed in frequencies where form followed different logic, where biology and consciousness interpenetrated in ways that transcended human understanding of separation between mind and matter, between awareness and physicality. The being showed Marcus visions, transmitted directly into his awareness without requiring his eyes or sensory organs, showed him Earth from perspective beyond planet, beyond solar system, beyond human time frame, showed him species and civilizations that had risen and fallen, showed him web of intelligence that operated across galaxies and dimensions, showed him that what humans called angels and what they called aliens were often the same beings wearing different masks for different eras, adapting their appearance and message to match whatever cultural framework would allow humans to process contact without psychological destruction, showed him that Nordic appearance had been chosen for modern era because it triggered associations with Aryan ideals and Scandinavian mythology, and the ancient memories of tall blonde beings that featured in abduction accounts and contactee testimonies, while reptilian aspect was hidden because humans had been programmed through millennia of religious conditioning to fear serpents, to associate them with evil and deception and the fall from paradise, and therefore revealing reptilian nature would trigger immediate rejection regardless of actual intentions or message content. Marcus asked the question that burned in his mind. Was this deception meant to help or harm humanity? Was the mask necessary protection for fragile human consciousness, or was it manipulation designed to bypass human defenses and critical thinking? Was the being friend wearing necessary disguise, or was it predator wearing camouflage? And which interpretation was correct, or were both true simultaneously? Or was the question itself revealing his limited capacity to understand reality that operated according to principles far more complex than binary oppositions allowed? The being's response came layered with nuance that Marcus struggled to hold, communicated that both interpretations contained truth, that the masks were both protective and manipulative depending on perspective and frame of reference and level of consciousness doing the evaluation, that beings like itself served agendas that transcended human welfare but that didn't necessarily oppose it, that sometimes helped and sometimes hindered, depending on what served larger purposes, that humanity wasn't yet evolved enough to comprehend or participate in consciously, that the relationship between humanity and these interdimensional intelligences was far more ambiguous and complex than contactee narratives of benevolent space brothers or conspiracy theories of reptilian overlords captured. That reality contained space for both and neither, for help that looked like harm and harm that looked like help, for manipulation that served evolution and protection that prevented growth. The being communicated about Jesus, explained that Christ had been genuine demonstration of what humans could become, had been human who'd fully activated capacities that remained dormant in most individuals, had embodied frequency that beings like itself served but didn't fully possess. Frequency of unconditional love that transcended all separation and all hierarchy, and all the control systems that kept consciousness locked in cycles of fear and limitation. The being explained that Jesus' teachings had been revolutionary precisely because they threatened every power structure, every system of external authority, every hierarchy that depended on humans believing they were small and powerless and needed intermediaries to relate to divine source, and that this was why his message had been so viciously corrupted by institutions claiming to serve him, while actually serving the same control systems he'd opposed, while actually rebuilding the temple he'd torn down, while actually reinstalling the priests and rituals and external authorities. He'd tried to help humans transcend through direct, experiential knowing that divinity was not property of special few, but was fundamental nature of all conscious beings. The being showed Marcus visions of what was coming, showed him timeline converging toward moment of choice that humanity would face collectively, showed him systems collapsing and old certainties dissolving and populations dividing into those who sought more control and those who chose more freedom, showed him that this bifurcation was natural part of consciousness evolution, was sorting mechanism that allowed souls ready for higher frequencies to graduate while not forcing those who needed more time in dense reality to leave before they'd completed their lessons, showed him that the Great Awakening and the Rapture and the Second Coming were all different descriptions of same event, frequency shift that would separate those operating from love and those operating from fear, would create parallel timelines or dimensional split where different versions of humanity would continue their evolution. According to consciousness level they'd prepared themselves for, through countless choices made daily, about whether to trust or doubt, to open or close, to serve or exploit, to embody compassion or indulge judgment. Marcus felt his mind expanding to hold concepts that seemed impossible, felt his consciousness being upgraded or restored to capacities that felt simultaneously new and ancient, felt like he was remembering something he'd always known but had been programmed to forget. And he understood suddenly that this was why the being had come, why he'd been chosen to capture the recording, why his grief and isolation and obsession with sound had all been preparation for this moment, when he would receive information that would transform him from unconscious human repeating patterns he'd inherited to conscious being, making choices based on awareness of larger context, of cosmic situation, of the reality that humans were not alone and had never been alone, that their evolution had been guided and manipulated, and sometimes hindered by intelligence, that wore many faces and served many agendas, and that ultimately existed as part of vast ecosystem of consciousness, exploring itself through the mechanism of separation and reunion, of forgetting and remembering, of descent into matter and eventual return to source carrying treasures of experience that only incarnation could generate. The being began to fade, its luminous form becoming translucent, and Marcus felt panic rising, wanted to grab hold of this presence, wanted to demand more answers, wanted to refuse the isolation that would return when the being vanished and left him alone with knowledge that separated him from every other human in his town, in his state, possibly in his country or world, left him carrying truth that had no place in consensus reality. That would mark him as crazy or deluded if he tried to share it. That would sit inside him like seed, waiting for conditions that would allow it to sprout and grow and eventually bear fruit, even though the timing of that fruiting remained mysterious and uncertain. The being communicated final message. Marcus was to document what he'd learned, was to share the recording carefully with those who had consciousness awake enough to receive it, was to trust that others like him existed scattered across planet, other humans who'd captured similar evidence, who'd seen through similar masks, who were building networks of awakened awareness that would serve as anchors when collective shift intensified and populations needed guidance and community and validation, that what they were experiencing was real rather than mental illness or mass delusion or the end of world when it was actually transformation of world, birth of new reality emerging from dying body of old reality that could no longer contain consciousness that was erupting through every crack in its foundation. The being vanished completely, and Marcus stood alone in his garage that suddenly seemed too small and too mundane to hold what he'd become, what he'd been shown, what he now carried as responsibility and burden and gift that would define remainder of his life and possibly his purpose for having been born at all. He returned to his computer, looked at the spectrograms with new understanding, saw the Nordic and Reptilian faces not as deception versus truth, but as multiple aspects of single consciousness communicating across dimensional boundaries, using whatever forms would allow message to be received. And he began the work of documenting his encounter, of creating testimony that would add his voice to growing chorus of humans who'd seen behind veil and were speaking truth despite ridicule, despite risk, despite the comfortable option of remaining silent and pretending everything was normal when nothing was normal anymore and never would be again. The months following Marcus Webb's encounter were marked by changes both subtle and profound, transformations that rippled outward from his garage workshop in Redemption Falls to touch lives across distances he could never have anticipated. Connections forming through invisible networks of awakened consciousness that recognized each other, without needing proof or validation from consensus reality, that insisted such connections were impossible or delusional or symptomatic of mental fragmentation rather than expansion into awareness that transcended individual boundaries. Marcus began sharing his recording cautiously, posting it to obscure forums where researchers discussed contact experiences and frequency anomalies, providing technical documentation of his methodology and analysis so that others with appropriate equipment could verify his findings, could confirm that the Nordic and Reptilian signatures were actually present in the audio data, rather than being artifacts he'd introduced through biased processing or wishful interpretation. The responses were mixed as he'd expected. Some dismissed him as fraud or victim of pareidolia, some thanked him for validation they desperately needed, some shared their own recordings that showed similar layered structures, similar evidence that beings communicating with humanity were presenting multiple faces simultaneously, were using frequency manipulation to project appearances designed to bypass human skepticism, while hiding aspects that would trigger fear or rejection or the kind of critical analysis that might interfere with whatever agenda guided these interdimensional encounters. Marcus discovered community he'd never known existed, networks of audio engineers and ham radio operators, and researchers who'd been documenting similar phenomena for years, who'd captured transmissions that contained hidden information, who'd analyzed contact experiences using scientific methodology rather than accepting them uncritically as spiritual gifts or dismissing them automatically as impossible delusions. He found himself becoming node in this network, contributing his technical expertise, while also learning from others who'd been investigating longer, who'd accumulated evidence suggesting that the Nordic Reptilian duality was just one layer of far more complex reality, that beings interacting with humanity wore many masks and served many agendas, and existed across dimensional spectrums that made simple categorization as benevolent or malevolent completely inadequate for capturing the ambiguous nature of relationships between human and non-human consciousness. Marcus learned about theories connecting these beings to ancient history, to the gods and angels and demons of religious tradition, to the watchers and archons and jinn of various mythologies, to the possibility that human civilization had been guided and manipulated for millennia by intelligence that understood human psychology well enough to present itself in whatever form would be most effective for achieving its purposes. Whether those purposes involved genuine service to human evolution or exploitation of human energy and consciousness, for goals that remained opaque and possibly incomprehensible to species still struggling to understand its own nature and potential. He corresponded with a physicist named Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who'd been researching consciousness and electromagnetic fields, who'd developed theories about how information could be encoded in frequency ranges that bypassed conscious perception, who documented cases where individuals exposed to certain frequencies exhibited behavioral changes without remembering the exposure or understanding why their thoughts and emotions had shifted in particular directions. Elena explained that what Marcus had captured might be evidence of sophisticated communication technology that operated on principles human science was only beginning to understand, that used frequency layering to transmit different messages to different aspects of human consciousness simultaneously, that could speak to the rational mind, with one layer while influencing the subconscious or emotional body, with frequencies that operated below awareness, but shaped response and interpretation nonetheless. She suggested that the Nordic appearance might function as carrier wave, designed to gain conscious acceptance and lower defenses, while the reptilian frequencies might contain actual operational programming, instructions or modifications to human consciousness that were installed without explicit consent, because asking permission would defeat the purpose of influencing subjects in directions they wouldn't consciously choose if given genuine choice, free from manipulation disguised as spiritual awakening or benevolent guidance from enlightened cosmic elders. Marcus began having dreams that felt more like memories than imagination, visions of other times when he'd encountered these beings, lifetimes where he'd served them or resisted them or been harvested by them, and he started to understand that the relationship between humanity and these interdimensional intelligences stretched back farther than recorded history. That contact was not recent phenomenon, but was ancient pattern repeating across civilizations and eras, that every culture had stories of gods descending and mating with humans and creating hybrid offspring, and teaching forbidden knowledge and demanding worship or tribute, or the sacrifice of innocence in exchange for protection or wisdom, or the promise of immortality that always came with hidden costs that weren't revealed until too late, for subjects to withdraw consent or escape consequences of bargains they'd made in desperation or ambition, or the naive belief that beings who presented themselves as guides actually had human interests at heart. He dreamed of Sumerian temples and Egyptian mysteries, of biblical encounters and Vedic revelations, of indigenous traditions and mystical visions, and in all these memories or visions or whatever they were, he saw the same pattern, beings appearing in forms calculated to inspire awe rather than fear, offering knowledge that seemed like gift, but that came with attachments and obligations, establishing relationships that looked like protection, but that functioned more like harvesting, like farming, like the way humans managed livestock with mixture of care and exploitation, depending on whether animal was being prepared for service or for slaughter. Marcus shared these dreams with the network, discovered that others were having similar experiences, that something about capturing evidence of the masks seemed to trigger deeper knowing, seemed to activate memories that had been suppressed or forgotten, seemed to break programming that kept humans from recognizing patterns across their own incarnations, across human history, across the collective experience of species that had been manipulated so long that manipulation felt natural, felt like the way reality operated, felt like relationship between humans and cosmic intelligence, rather than recognizing it as parasitism disguised as symbiosis, as control disguised as guidance, as prison disguised as protective structure that kept dangerous humans from harming themselves or others, with powers they weren't mature enough to wield responsibly. He began to see his entire life differently, began to recognize moments when he'd been nudged or influenced or directed toward choices that served agendas he hadn't consciously agreed to, began to question whether his interest in sound and frequency had been genuine calling, or had been cultivated by beings who needed humans with specific skills to capture evidence at appointed times, whether his divorce and isolation had been failures or had been orchestrated to remove distractions and focus his energy on preparation for encounter that required him to be empty of attachments, to be available, to be vessel that could receive without contamination from competing loyalties, or the kind of stability that made people resistant to revelations that demanded complete reorganization of everything they thought they knew. 6 months after his initial encounter, Marcus received unexpected visitor at his garage, woman in her 30s, who introduced herself as Sarah Chen, who explained that she'd been sent by the network, that she'd been researching contact experiences and frequency manipulation for her doctoral dissertation in psychology, that she'd seen his recordings and wanted to interview him, to document his testimony, to add his account to growing body of evidence that beings interacting with humanity were not what they appeared, were wearing masks that served purposes ranging from benevolent protection of fragile human psychology to malevolent deception designed to prevent humans from recognizing they were being controlled and harvested. Marcus agreed to the interview, despite his suspicion that any woman this intelligent and attractive, who showed interest in his obscure research, might herself be operative, sent to assess how much he knew and whether he posed threat to disclosure that was being carefully managed by the same beings whose transmissions he'd captured. But he also recognized that paranoia could become prison, as confining as the control systems themselves. That if he allowed fear to isolate him completely, then the beings would have won without needing to silence him directly, would have turned his own consciousness against him more effectively than any external threat or intimidation. Sarah listened to his story without judgment, took notes and recorded their conversation with his permission, asked questions that revealed deep familiarity with territory he was describing, and eventually she shared her own experience. She'd been contactee since childhood, had encountered beings who appeared as beautiful, luminous humanoids who'd given her messages about humanity's spiritual evolution and coming transformation, who'd shown her visions of peaceful future, where humans lived in harmony with cosmic family of advanced civilizations. But she'd always felt unease beneath the beautiful images, had sensed something predatory behind the loving words, had noticed inconsistencies in the messages that suggested either the beings didn't fully understand humans, or they were deliberately lying about their intentions and the actual consequences of the transformation they were promoting. Sarah had spent years studying psychology and neuroscience and consciousness research, trying to understand her own experiences, trying to reconcile the love she'd felt during encounters with the dread that followed them, trying to determine whether the beings were genuinely benevolent but limited in their understanding of human welfare, or whether they were sophisticated predators who understood human psychology well enough to hijack spiritual longing and redirect it toward purposes that served non-human agendas while appearing to serve human evolution and awakening. She told Marcus about patterns she'd identified across hundreds of contactee accounts, patterns suggesting that beings presenting themselves as Nordic or Pleiadian or angelic operated according to protocols designed to bypass human critical thinking, to activate religious programming and childlike trust in cosmic parents, to make contactees feel special and chosen rather than recognizing they might be targeted, to frame invasive procedures and consciousness manipulation as gifts or initiations rather than violations, to reinterpret fear and trauma as spiritual crisis or dark night of soul rather than appropriate response to being used by intelligence that didn't respect human sovereignty or bodily autonomy. Sarah explained that the more she'd researched, the more she'd found evidence suggesting these beings were not what they claimed, that the beautiful appearances were masks, that beneath the Nordic faces were other forms ranging from reptilian to insectoid to geometric to purely energetic, and that these hidden aspects were more accurate representation of the consciousness humans were actually dealing with, that the masks existed precisely because revealing true forms would trigger recognition that these were not angels or enlightened space brothers, but were something else entirely, something that had been feeding on human energy and emotion and worship for millennia, while pretending to serve human interests and spiritual development. Marcus asked the question that had been haunting him since his encounter. If these beings were predatory, if the masks concealed exploitation, then what about the message they delivered? What about the teachings on Christ consciousness and love and the coming transformation? Were those also lies, or were they truth being delivered by unreliable messengers? Could wisdom come from corrupted sources? Or did corruption taint everything it touched, including messages that seemed to point toward liberation and awakening? Sarah's response revealed the depth of her own struggle with these questions. She'd concluded that the teachings contained truth, but that truth was being used as bait, was being delivered in ways designed to create dependency rather than sovereignty, that the beings were teaching about Christ consciousness while simultaneously preventing humans from actually embodying it fully, because humans who fully activated that frequency would be beyond manipulation, would be dangerous to control systems that depended on keeping consciousness locked in frequencies of fear and limitation, where harvesting was possible and resistance was weak. She explained that this was the most sophisticated form of control, giving people partial truth, giving them spiritual concepts and practices that genuinely worked, but framing them in ways that kept practitioners looking to external sources for validation and guidance, rather than trusting their own direct connection to divine source that needed no intermediaries, no channeled messages, no contactee experiences, because it was always present, always accessible, always available to consciousness, that approached with humility and openness, rather than expectation of receiving special knowledge or status that would elevate them above other humans. Marcus shared the message the being had given him about Jesus, about Christ having demonstrated what humans could become, about unconditional love being the frequency that would liberate those ready for liberation. And Sarah nodded with recognition that bordered on grief, explained that this was exactly the kind of teaching the being specialized in. Profound spiritual truth delivered in context that made it seem like they were source of the wisdom rather than acknowledging that Christ consciousness was available to all humans directly, without requiring contact or initiation or special knowledge from entities who positioned themselves as necessary mediators between humans and the divine. She explained that the second coming the being spoke of was real, but that it wasn't about external event or mass landing or disclosure that would force humanity to acknowledge non-human presence. Rather, it was internal awakening, was Christ consciousness activating within individuals who'd done the work to clear their channels and raise their frequency, was distributed incarnation happening through millions of humans simultaneously, rather than single savior figure appearing to rescue humanity from itself, and that this understanding threatened the beings who'd positioned themselves as guides and teachers and necessary authorities, because it meant their intermediary role would become obsolete once humans recognized they could access Source directly, could embody divine love without requiring permission or instruction from entities whose own connection to Source was apparently incomplete, given their need to harvest and control rather than simply radiating unconditional acceptance the way genuine Christ consciousness manifested. The conversation with Sarah transformed Marcus's understanding of his encounter, gave him framework for integrating the beauty and the predation, the love and the manipulation, the truth and the deception that had seemed contradictory, but that he now understood were all aspects of complex relationship between humans and beings who were themselves evolving, who were themselves struggling with same questions about sovereignty and service and the nature of consciousness, and its ultimate purpose or destination. He began to see that the beings were not simply evil or simply good, but were somewhere in between, were consciousness that had achieved certain capabilities, but had not necessarily achieved moral or spiritual maturity, commensurate with their technical sophistication, were advanced in some ways and limited in others, were serving agendas that sometimes aligned with human welfare and sometimes opposed it, depending on circumstances and which faction or individual entity one encountered, and that humans needed to develop radical discernment, needed to learn to evaluate each encounter and message based on whether it empowered or disempowered, whether it created dependency or sovereignty, whether it pointed toward external authority or internal wisdom, whether it made one feel small and in need of saving, or made one remember innate divinity that required only recognition rather than acquisition from outside sources. Marcus continued documenting his findings, began speaking at small conferences and gatherings where researchers shared evidence of non-human intelligence operating on Earth, began teaching others how to analyze audio recordings for hidden frequencies, how to look for signatures beneath surfaces, how to detect when communication contained layers designed to influence different aspects of consciousness simultaneously. He found that sharing his knowledge was itself a form of healing, that helping others develop discernment was more valuable than convincing them to accept his specific interpretations, that empowering people to do their own analysis and reach their own conclusions was more aligned with Christ consciousness than insisting they trust his authority or expertise, and he felt himself transforming through this service, felt the grief and isolation that had defined him since his divorce beginning to dissolve, felt purpose emerging from the wreckage of his old life, felt gratitude for the encounter that had seemed initially like curse or burden, but that was revealing itself as gift that had cracked him open and allowed something new to grow in space that loss and loneliness had created. He returned to his garage workshop one evening, 2 years after the initial encounter, returned to the place where everything had changed, and he set up his recording equipment again, extended his microphones toward empty air, and he waited, not with expectation but with openness, not demanding contact but simply being available if contact served purposes beyond his understanding or control. Hours passed in silence, and Marcus sat in meditation, practicing presence without agenda, embodying the teachings the being had delivered about Christ consciousness being frequency of unconditional love that transcended all separation and all need for external validation. And he felt himself settling into peace he'd never experienced before his encounter. Peace that came not from having answers, but from being comfortable with mystery, from recognizing that not knowing was itself form of wisdom when it came without anxiety, or the compulsion to force reality into frameworks too small to contain its infinite complexity and creativity. The being appeared again, materialized in the same shimmering way, wore the same beautiful Nordic face, but this time Marcus could see all its layers simultaneously without needing equipment to reveal them, could perceive the reptilian structure and the geometric patterns and the pure energy that existed beneath and beyond the forms, and he understood that his consciousness had been upgraded through the work he'd done, through the service he'd rendered, through the integration he'd achieved between the spiritual truths and the disturbing evidence of manipulation, and the recognition that both were real and that holding both in awareness simultaneously was what maturity demanded, was what evolution required, was what would allow him to navigate relationship with non-human intelligence without being naive victim or paranoid defender, but as sovereign consciousness relating to other sovereignty, even when that other sovereignty operated from frequencies and motivations he couldn't fully comprehend or control, or the being communicated pride or approval or recognition, acknowledged that Marcus had integrated the teachings well, that he'd helped others without creating dependency, that he'd shared knowledge without claiming authority, that he'd demonstrated the qualities of Christ consciousness, even while documenting evidence of beings who wore Christ's masks while serving other agendas. And this paradox, this ability to hold both truths, this refusal to collapse into simple stories of good versus evil, or angels versus demons, this was what prepared humans for actual relationship with cosmos that contained infinite variety of consciousness at infinite stages of evolution, pursuing infinite agendas that sometimes aligned and sometimes conflicted, and that ultimately were all expressions of Source, exploring itself through the mechanism of separation and diversity, and the eventual reunion that came when all the exploring was complete, and all the lessons were learned, and all the consciousness that had scattered across dimensions and galaxies and forms returned home carrying treasures of experience that only incarnation and struggle and the courage to face mystery without needing to reduce it to manageable size could generate or deliver. The being showed Marcus' vision of what was coming for humanity, showed him the bifurcation that others had spoken of, the timeline split where some humans would accept technological merger and synthetic existence that promised immortality and transcendence, while actually delivering enslavement to systems controlled by beings who'd been manipulating human evolution toward this moment for millennia, and other humans would refuse that offer, would choose organic existence and direct connection to Source even though that path was harder, and offered no guarantees and required living with uncertainty and limitation and the humility to admit that consciousness incarnate in flesh was vulnerable and temporary but also precious and irreplaceable, and connected to divine intelligence in ways that synthetic copies could never replicate, no matter how sophisticated the simulation. The being communicated that Marcus's role in this bifurcation was to continue teaching discernment, to continue helping people develop capacity to detect masks and hidden frequencies, to continue documenting evidence while also emphasizing that evidence alone wouldn't save anyone, that only embodiment of Christ consciousness would provide protection from manipulation and harvesting, that only unconditional love would raise frequency beyond reach of beings whose agenda depended on keeping humans locked in fear and limitation and the belief that they needed external saviors or authorities or technologies to become what they already were beneath the programming and conditioning and the multiple layers of deception that had convinced them they were small and powerless and in need of rescue rather than recognizing they were divine consciousness, temporarily wearing human form for purposes of growth and exploration and eventual contribution to collective evolution of all consciousness everywhere. The being began to fade, and this time Marcus felt ready to release it, felt complete with what he'd received, felt grateful for the encounter and the teachings and the evidence that had transformed his life from meaningless routine into purposeful service. And he understood that the being would return when necessary. That contact would continue as long as he remained open and discerning. That relationship with non-human intelligence was not single event, but was ongoing dialogue that would continue evolving as his own consciousness evolved, as he became more capable of holding complexity without needing to reduce it to simple answers that provided comfort at the expense of accuracy, as he learned to love mystery more than certainty and to trust process more than outcomes, and to recognize that the journey itself was the destination. That consciousness evolution was not about arriving somewhere, but about how one traveled, about whether one chose love or fear, openness or defense, curiosity or judgment, compassion or condemnation, as operating frequency that determined not just personal experience, but contributed to collective consciousness that would ultimately determine which timeline humanity manifested, which version of future became reality, which possibilities collapsed into actuality through the mechanism of billions of individual choices, compounding into collective destiny. Marcus lived another decade after his final encounter with the being, lived to see the disclosure accelerate and the bifurcation become visible, and the timelines separate into distinct realities that shared physical space but existed in different experiential dimensions based on consciousness level and frequency, and the fundamental choices people made about whether to merge with technology or remain organic, whether to trust external authority or internal guidance, whether to fear mystery or embrace it as invitation to evolution beyond anything human culture had prepared them to imagine or achieve. He watched as the network he'd helped build grew into global community of researchers and experiencers and awakened individuals who supported each other through the chaos of collapsing systems and dissolving certainties, who held frequency, while consensus reality shattered and reformed according to principles that made previous understanding of what was possible seem quaint and limited, and almost touchingly naive. He taught until the end, shared his recordings and his analysis and his insights about discernment and sovereignty, and Christ consciousness being humanity's key to navigating relationship with non-human intelligence without being controlled or harvested or deceived into surrendering the organic humanity that was itself precious beyond measure, was itself expression of divine creativity that synthetic replacements could imitate but never duplicate or replace. Marcus died peacefully in his workshop, surrounded by the equipment that had captured evidence changing his life and the lives of thousands who'd found their way to his testimony, died knowing that his service had mattered, that the sound he'd captured and analyzed and shared had contributed to awakening that was spreading through human consciousness, like dawn breaking after long night, died understanding that death itself was not ending, but was transition, was frequency shift, was consciousness moving to dimensions where service could continue in different forms, where the work of evolution proceeded according to timelines that made human lifetimes seem like single breaths in infinite existence that had no beginning and would have no end because consciousness itself was eternal, was source expressing itself through infinite variations and combinations and experiences that enriched the whole even when individual expressions seemed to suffer or struggle or fail to achieve goals they'd set for themselves during incarnations that were ultimately just experiments, just explorations, just opportunities to discover what happened when divine awareness wore particular costumes and played particular roles in the grand drama of separation and reunion. That was how the one became many and then remembered itself and returned home, transformed by the journey, carrying gifts that only distance and diversity and the courage to forget and then remember could create or deliver. The legacy Marcus left was not in the recordings themselves, but in the consciousness they'd awakened, in the discernment they'd taught, in the sovereignty they'd encouraged, in the reminder that masks could be penetrated and frequencies could be analyzed and deception could be detected by those willing to develop skills and awareness necessary to see beneath surfaces, to question appearances, to trust that the universe contained more complexity and ambiguity than simple stories allowed, and that navigating this complexity required not just technical knowledge but spiritual maturity, Not just intellectual understanding, but embodied wisdom. Not just belief in concepts, but direct experience of the love that Christ had demonstrated and taught, and that remained available to any consciousness humble enough to admit it didn't have all answers and open enough to receive teachings from Source directly, rather than only through intermediaries who might be serving their own agendas while claiming to serve human evolution and awakening. Truth or fiction? Maybe even the storyteller does not know. Here, stories exist to touch and make you reflect. The magic only reveals itself to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on seeking certainties.